Now here's Claude Lemieux bringing it back up for New Jersey. Lemieux with a shot. He scores! Claude Lemieux with...
How does one of the toughest men in NHL history suddenly leave the world just days after standing in front of thousands of cheering fans? That's the question shaking the hockey world right now after the shocking death of Claude Lemieux at the age of *60. For decades, Claude built a reputation as one of the most feared and controversial players hockey had ever seen. Some fans loved him, others absolutely hated him. But no matter what side people were on, almost everyone agreed on one thing. Claude Lemieux was impossible to ignore. Now, following heartbreaking reports surrounding his passing, fans are revisiting his final public appearance, old interviews, legendary fights, and the intense legacy he leaves behind. And what makes this entire story even more emotional is that nobody saw this coming. Just days before everything changed, Claude appeared smiling and energetic during a public ceremony connected to the NHL playoffs. To fans watching at home, he looked completely normal, relaxed, proud, happy to be back in the spotlight, which is exactly why the news hit so hard. And once reports surrounding the early hours of May, *28th, started spreading online, shock quickly turned into disbelief. Because for many hockey fans, Claude Lemieux wasn't just another former player. He represented an entire era of NHL history that felt tougher, louder, and far more ruthless than today's game. Bien long before social media existed, Claude had already become one of hockey's ultimate villains. Throughout his career, he built a reputation for getting under opponents' skin in ways almost nobody else could. He wasn't the biggest player on the ice, he wasn't always the fastest, but he had something that made him dangerous: an ability to completely throw opponents off their game. Fans still remember the brutal rivalries, the trash talk, the playoff chaos, the fights that turned into full-team brawls. Claude didn't just play hockey. He made people emotional, sometimes furious. Opposing arenas booed him relentlessly. Players openly called him annoying. Some even said he crossed the line. But at the exact same time, teammates absolutely loved having him on their side, because when the pressure became unbearable, that's what made him such a complicated figure. Behind all the controversy was a player who won *4 Stanley Cups and built a career most athletes could only dream about. He captured championships with the Montreal Canadiens, New Jersey Devils, and Colorado Avalanche. In the biggest playoff moments, Claude somehow always seemed to appear at exactly the right time. While critics focused on his aggressive behavior, coaches focused on something else entirely: winning. In *1995, he earned the Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP after an unforgettable postseason performance. That achievement forced even some of his harshest critics to admit something they didn't want to say. Claude Lemieux wasn't just an agitator, he was elite, and that combination made him terrifying. Lamb's fans online are now revisiting old playoff footage where Claude seemed completely fearless. Huge hits, violent rivalries, last-second goals. He thrived inside chaos in a way very few athletes ever have. But despite the image he showed on the ice, people closest to him described a completely different person away from the cameras. And nowhere was that more visible than inside his family. Claude is survived by his wife Deborah Lemieux and their *4 children, including fellow NHL player Brendan Lemieux. Over the years, Brendan often spoke publicly about how much his father meant to him. In one interview that's now spreading rapidly online again, Brendan called Claude his biggest role model on and off the ice. He talked about being proud of his father's career and even joked about loving how hated out his dad was during his playing days. Looking back now, those words hit differently. Because beneath the tough guy image hockey fans saw for years was still a father supporting his son's dream. People close to the sport say Claude remained deeply connected to hockey long after retirement, finishing his NHL career. He reportedly worked as a player agent and stayed active around the game that made him famous. Bland, which is why his final public appearance feels so haunting to many fans. Now, just days before his death, Claude participated in a ceremonial torch presentation connected to Game *3 of the Eastern Conference Finals. Cameras captured him smiling in front of the crowd as fans cheered loudly. Peldians, at the time, nobody thought anything unusual about it. But after the shocking news broke, social media immediately filled with emotional reactions from fans saying the footage now feels eerie to watch. Some online even began speculating whether Claude may have been privately struggling in ways nobody recognized publicly. Right now, though, much of that remains speculation, and the Lemieux family has asked for privacy during this difficult time. Bien still, that hasn't stopped the hockey world from asking painful questions. According to reports that quickly spread across major outlets, authorities in Palm Beach County responded during the early hours of May 20-8 to what was described as a self-harm incident at a furniture showroom. OMD, the NHL Alumni Association, later confirmed Claude's passing at age 60. Abanda, almost immediately, tributes started pouring in from across the hockey world. Former teammates, fans, reporters, even longtime rivals shared emotional messages remembering one of the most unforgettable players of his generation. Plondi Geoff Molson, company owner of the Montreal Canadiens, called it a dark day for both the franchise and the hockey community. He described Claude as relentless and someone who embodied the spirit of the Canadiens during his years with the team. What's interesting is how many fans who once booed Claude are now posting tributes celebrating him. Blinden, that says a lot about the impact he had on hockey. Banja, because players like Claude Lemieux rarely exist in modern sports anymore. Today's NHL is faster, cleaner, and far more controlled. But during Claude's era, hockey felt raw, emotional, personal. Rivalries weren't just business, they became genuine hatred, and Claude stood directly at the center of that storm. For years, he embraced being the villain. He knew fans hated him, he knew opponents targeted him, and honestly, he seemed to enjoy every second of it. But now, after his passing, fans are seeing another side of the story. Instead of the pest, instead of the agitator, instead of the player opponents couldn't stand, people are remembering the competitor, the father, the teammate, the champion, and perhaps most heartbreaking of all. They're wondering whether one of hockey's toughest figures may have been carrying struggles nobody else could see. That conversation has grown much louder online over the past day as fans revisit interviews, playoff highlights, and emotional family moments connected to Claude's life. Some say his story is a reminder that fame, toughness, and success don't always reveal what someone is dealing with privately. Others simply can't believe someone who looked so strong for so many years is suddenly gone. And either way, one thing is certain, Claude Lemieux left a mark on hockey that won't disappear anytime soon. Banking over 21 NHL seasons, he became one of the sport's most polarizing names. He scored more than 300 goals, won multiple championships, created some of hockey's nastiest rivalries, and somehow stayed relevant across multiple generations of fans. Love him or hate him, people watched when Claude Lemieux stepped onto the ice. And now the hockey world is left trying to process a future without one of its most unforgettable personalities. And in the end, Claude spent his entire career surviving pressure, violence, hatred, and chaos in one of the toughest sports on earth. But today, fans are mourning something much bigger than hockey stats or championship rings. They're mourning a man who shaped an era. And for many people watching this story unfold, The most heartbreaking part is knowing that even the toughest legends can sometimes be fighting battles nobody else ever sees. Claude Lemieux wasn't just hated in the NHL, he almost seemed to enjoy it. Long before social media turned athletes into celebrities, Claude had already built a reputation as hockey's ultimate villain. Fans booed him everywhere he played. Opponents couldn't stand him. And every time he stepped onto the ice, people expected chaos to follow. Bah, he wasn't the biggest player in the league, and he definitely wasn't the flashiest. But Claude had something far more dangerous, the ability to completely get inside people's heads. He trash-talked constantly, played aggressively, crossed the line in the eyes of many fans. And during heated rivalries, things often exploded the moment Claude got involved. Some players called him a pest. Others used much harsher words. But here's the part that made him so terrifying. Bland, while everyone was focused on hating him, Claude kept winning. Goen. He captured 4 Stanley Cups during his NHL career and became one of the most clutch playoff performers of his era. Somehow, in the biggest moments, he always found a way to deliver. Believed. That's why teammates loved him, even when opponents despised him. Bent to rival fans, Claude Lemieux represented everything annoying about old-school hockey. But to coaches and teammates, he was the kind of player every championship team secretly wanted. And, honestly, that contradiction followed him his entire career. The louder the boos became, the more dangerous Claude seemed to get. But behind all the fights, controversy, and villain reputation, there was another side to Claude that very few people ever got to see. And that's where the story becomes far more emotional. For all the criticism Claude Lemieux received during his career, even his biggest haters admitted one thing. When the pressure was highest, he showed up. Some players disappeared during the playoffs. Claude somehow became even more dangerous. Bond, game after game, series after series, he built a reputation as someone who thrived in chaos. While other players cracked under pressure, Claude seemed completely comfortable inside it. Big goals, brutal hits, heated rivalries. He lived for those moments, and the results spoke for themselves. 4 Stanley Cups, more than 300 career goals. A Conn Smythe Trophy as playoff MVP in 1995. That award changed how many people viewed him forever, because it proved Claude wasn't just an agitator creating drama on the ice. He was one of the most effective playoff performers of his generation. Vanda fans still debate whether his villain mentality actually gave him an edge. The louder the crowd booed him, the more locked in he seemed to become. And teammates absolutely loved that about him. And many players later admitted that while opponents hated facing Claude, having him on your side felt completely different. He brought energy, confidence, and unpredictability that could instantly change an entire game. That's why coaches kept trusting him in the biggest moments year after year. But while hockey fans mostly saw the aggressive competitor, his family saw someone entirely different behind the scenes. Behind the villain reputation and the playoff chaos, Claude Lemieux was something fans rarely connected with his on-ice image. A father first. Away from the arenas and the noise of the crowd, he wasn't the player people booed or argued about online. He was just a dad trying to support his family and guide them through the same world that made him famous. One of the most emotional parts of his story is his relationship with his son, Brendan Lemieux, who followed him into the NHL. Brendan didn't just inherit the hockey talent, he also grew up watching firsthand what it meant to survive in one of the toughest leagues in the world. And Brendan never hid how much his father meant to him. In interviews, he described Claude as his biggest role model, not just for hockey, but for life. He talked about the discipline, the mindset, and the mentality he learned just from watching his dad handle pressure and criticism at the highest level. To fans, Claude was the villain of the NHL. Smond. But to Brendan, he was the reason he stepped onto the ice in the first place. And that contrast is what makes this part of his story hit differently. Now, the same player who spent his career being booed by thousands was, at home, someone his family looked up to completely, denned, because before the headlines, before the controversies, and before the rivalries, he was just a father trying to leave something behind that mattered. And that's what makes everything that comes next even harder to process. Today's board, Claude Lemieux was back in the spotlight in a way that felt completely normal at the time. He appeared at a public NHL-related ceremony during the Eastern Conference Finals, taking part in a torch presentation in front of fans and cameras. People in the crowd cheered. Cameras captured him smiling, calm, and fully present in the moment. Nothing about it raised concern. In fact, for many fans watching, it felt like a simple celebration of a hockey legend being honored for his legacy. But looking back now, that moment carries a very different weight. Because after news of his passing broke, that same footage started circulating everywhere online. Fans began replaying it, trying to find signs they may have missed. The same smile that once felt ordinary now feels haunting to some viewers. No, and that's where speculation started to spread. On discussions quick, with fans wondering if there were struggles happening behind the scenes that nobody outside his close circle ever saw. However, nothing has been officially confirmed, and much of this remains speculation. Still, the timing has left many people unsettled. Blinds. Just days after standing in front of a cheering crowd, Claude was suddenly gone, leaving behind questions that fans are still trying to understand. And as the hockey world searched for answers, the official reports would only deepen the shock even further. Jahan Apapki, script, hi, Jahan number, core, English words, mein convert kar dia gaya, hi. In the early hours of May 28th, reports began emerging that immediately stunned the hockey world. According to statements referenced in media coverage, authorities in Palm Beach County responded to an incident described as a self-harm situation at a furniture showroom. Soon after, the NHL Alumni Association confirmed the passing of Claude Lemieux at the age of 60. The news spread rapidly, and within minutes, social media was flooded with disbelief. Fans struggled to process how quickly everything had unfolded, especially after seeing him publicly just days earlier. The Lemieux family also released a request for privacy during this extremely difficult time, asking people to respect their space as they grieved. However, what made this moment even heavier was how fast speculation began circulating online. Some discussions tried to connect earlier public appearances with what may have been happening privately, but nothing beyond official reports has been confirmed. And while questions started spreading across the internet, the hockey world itself shifted almost immediately into mourning. Because for teammates, rivals, and fans alike, this wasn't just news. It was the loss of a figure who had defined an entire era of the game. And the reactions that followed showed just how deep that impact really went. The moment news broke about Claude Lemieux's passing, the reaction across the hockey world was immediate and emotional. Former teammates, rivals, and fans all started sharing memories of a player who had defined one of the most intense eras in NHL history. And even those who spent years on the opposite side of his aggressive style admitted that his impact on the game was impossible to ignore. Geoff Molson, representing the Montreal Canadiens organization, where Claude began his rise to fame, described it as a devastating loss for the entire hockey community. He spoke about Claude's competitiveness, his fearlessness, and the way he elevated his team during crucial playoff moments. Banda, around the league, similar messages began appearing. Bite. Former players and analysts reflected on how rare it is to find someone who could be so controversial, yet so effective at the highest level. Some called him one of the most memorable playoff performers of his generation. Others simply referred to him as a difference maker in big games. But what stood out even more was the shift in how fans responded. MDN's people who once booed Claude Lemieux for years were suddenly posting highlights, tributes, and old playoff clips celebrating his career. Rival fans admitted that, love him or hate him, he made hockey more intense, more emotional, and far more unpredictable. Bland on social media, threads filled with memories of iconic playoff moments and heated rivalries quickly went viral. Fans debated his legacy, but the overall tone wasn't anger anymore, it was respect. And that's what made the reaction so powerful. Because Claude Lemieux wasn't just another NHL player who came and went. He was someone who left a mark so strong that even his critics couldn't ignore it after he was gone. Then, in the middle of all the tributes, one thing became clear: his presence shaped entire eras of hockey history. And his absence now leaves a noticeable void in the sport's most passionate stories. And as the hockey world continues to process what happened, one final question remains. How do you define a legacy that was built on both admiration and controversy at the same time? Claude Lemieux's legacy is one of the most complicated in NHL history. And maybe that's exactly what makes it so unforgettable. On paper, his career is easy to define. 4 Stanley Cups, over 300 new a Conn Smythe Trophy. More than 2 decades in the league, competing at the highest level of hockey. But numbers alone never told the full story, because Claude wasn't just a player who won games. He changed the emotional temperature of them. Every time he stepped on the ice, something shifted. Rivalries became personal. Crowds became louder, pressure became heavier, and he thrived in all of it. Blonde, few players in NHL history have ever been labeled both a champion and a villain at the same time so consistently. He was the kind of athlete who forced a reaction no matter what he did, whether scoring a clutch playoff goal or getting under an opponent's skin until everything boiled over. Blinged, that kind of presence doesn't fade easily. Even that. His name still comes up whenever people talk about the most intense playoff performers in hockey history. Younger fans go back and watch old footage and are often shocked at how different the game felt when Claude was involved. Because today's NHL is different, cleaner, faster, more structured. Players are controlled, systems are tighter, and personalities like his are far rarer. Done. That's why many fans now say it's unlikely we'll ever see another player like Claude Lemieux again. Someone who could be hated by half the league but still end up with multiple championships and playoff MVP honors. And yet, what makes his legacy even more powerful is that it cannot be placed into a single category. Dane hero or villain, dirty player or clutch champion, loved or hated, Claude Lemieux was all of it at once. And now, as fans reflect on his career following his passing, the conversation has shifted from controversy to appreciation, not for how he played the game, but for how unforgettable he made it. Bland. Because, in the end, legends aren't always defined by being perfect. Sometimes they're defined by being impossible to ignore, and Claude Lemieux was exactly that. Claude Lemieux's story doesn't end the way most hockey careers do. There's no simple label that fits him. No clean division between hero and villain. Instead, what remains is something far more complicated and far more human. He was a player who built a career in the middle of chaos, pressure, and constant scrutiny. A man who embraced the role of the villain when it suited his team, and a champion who delivered when everything was on the line. And now, looking back, fans are left trying to piece together a legacy that feels larger than the headlines that once followed him. Because the same player who was booed in arenas across North America is also the one who lifted Stanley Cups. changed playoff series and defined moments that hockey fans will never forget. But beyond the stats, beyond the fights, and beyond the controversy, there is still a lingering feeling that his story carries something deeper. Lem's a reminder that even the toughest competitors can have battles no one else ever sees. In the end, Claude Lemieux will be remembered for what he did on the ice, the intensity, the rivalries, the championships, and the moments that made hockey feel bigger than life, but he will also be remembered for something else, for proving that legacy is never just one thing. Yeah. And for leaving behind a story that the hockey world will be talking about for a very long time.